You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
My name is Raul, by the way. What's yours?
Jason.
Jason. All right. Well, nice to meet you, Jason.
Nice to meet you.
So, I'm conducting interviews today on a topic known as street epistemology,
Okay.
which is, it deals with what people believe in and how they establish those beliefs. How do you know that that thing is true, whatever it is? And so, typically the way I do the interviews is you identify something you believe in. It can be anything at all: God belief, aliens, ghosts, politics, whatever. Something you believe in, something that's deeply held, something that's foundational, that you're fairly convinced of. And I ask you questions related to how do you know that that thing is true? So some knowledge claim about the world that you really believe in.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's do this.
Yeah. All right.
Do you want to identify something?
I guess we can go with like a religious belief.
Sure.
I believe in God.
Okay, I believe in God, all right? And why do you believe in God?
I believe in God because I've seen His work or their work in everything that we do, and I believe that we can't be here just by chance. I believe that we were put here for a reason.
Okay. So you believe in God because you've seen His work, and we can't be here by chance.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So how did you determine that? When you say you see His work, can you kind of expound on that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I'm from the West. I'm not even from this area.
Oh yeah,
And
what
so,
part of the West?
Las Vegas specifically, born and raised.
Interesting.
Bad example of His work, but
Why? Because it's desert?
well, no, not
Because it's Vegas.
because it's Vegas.
Yeah.
Because it's in city. But I'm talking something as marvelous as the Grand Canyon, or being from the West and seeing some of these huge mountains and some of these huge, things that again can't be there by chance. I just see the majesty in all of life, and I just can't believe that it's just happened that way.
And why do you say you can't believe that it just happened that way?
Everything's just so complicated. Our human brains are so complicated. People are so complicated. It just, I get that rolling a dice, but rolling a dice hundreds of millions of times to create what we are right now just doesn't seem possible.
Okay. So you can't believe that nature is so complicated the way it is?
Yeah.
Okay. What would convince you that the various works that you see are not due to a God of some kind?
I guess in death, you would find out whether. I can't really come back and say not true or so, but I would say that's the only way to truly know whether you were right or wrong.
Okay. You don't think there's any way to know in this life?
Unless there's a second coming, of course,
Right.
in that concept, but in that case there would be death, depending on what your version of Revelation says. But yeah.
Is there any way to put this claim to the test? To verify whether or not this is all his work?
I feel it'd be really difficult because, again, in the Bible, in and of itself, it says not to test him. It specifically says that. And so, I think that there's a lot of God's work that you see done when, things come to fruition for yourself, or you can see those who are maybe more godly or more in the Word. More things tend to happen for those who are more faith-based than those who aren't.
Okay. So you feel like good things tend to happen more to people who are godly?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah. It's a complicated concept, but
yeah, that's another interesting one. I would love to ask you more about that.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get off track of the nature thing.
Yeah.
So you said there's really no way to test the idea of this being his work, of this being all due to God? Okay.
Yeah, I can't think of a way to test it.
And on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain would you say you are that all of nature is due to God?
I would give it 100%.
100%?
Yeah, I'm fairly, I would say, relatively newer in my faith, so it hasn't been my whole life. But more in the last maybe 6 years or so, which is fairly young, I guess, for a believer.
Okay.
Yeah.
What would convince you that there was some non-God reason for some of the things you mentioned in nature? That it was due to some natural causes or some non-divine reason? What would get you there? What would convince you? What would shake your certainty, even just a little bit? What would reduce your level of certitude?
I just can't think of. It's so complicated of a concept. I guess if there was something that wasn't a divine being, something would still have to explain why that thing started in the first place, like what triggered that something to start.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I say it has to be something divine, because something had to start from something. That question then loops back into people who argue there is no God, to like what created God in the first place. And I totally understand the argument, but I still think something had to start everything. I believe if that's a divine being, then that's
okay. So, and why do you believe that it's a divine being?
Because again, the chances of all these things have been created over time,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of how much time that people believe in.
Yeah.
I feel it's too complicated to, even if it's been, some people believe millions and billions of years,
Mm-hmm.
like it's just been too overly complicated.
Is it possible for us to have complicated things in nature and yet it not be due to God?
I mean, not necessarily. No, because what the tools that we've received to do all these complicated things, if they did exist, are due to God giving us the correct tools to make those things happen.
I'm not sure I understand.
So, I guess repeat your question.
Yeah. Is it
Maybe I
possible?
misunderstood.
Is it possible for us to have complicated things in nature and yet it not be due to God?
No. Yeah, because I can't think of something that's complicated in nature that I wouldn't give praise to God for having it exist.
What would a thing that's complicated in nature that's not due to God look like?
Yeah, can't think of one, because it's still, I believe that everything exists for a reason, and that He is the reason why. If it's put on earth, it's here for a reason, whether it's good or bad.
How would you identify a complicated thing in nature that was actually due to nature and not some divine reason? How would you recognize that thing if it did exist?
That wasn't due to nature. I mean, nature's creating nature at a certain point, but like, what are you saying?
If we had a complicated thing in nature that was not due to God after all, that if it really did have some kind of natural cause to it, how would you know that? How would you identify that? How would you recognize it as such?
I would have no idea.
Okay. And how do you recognize something that's complicated in nature that does have a divine reason?
I would say because the beginning of time created that. God created that. And so over time, He's continuously growing and populating and answering prayers in people's lives that
Mm-hmm.
continue to build upon what we see today.
Okay. So it sounds like a lot of your thinking centers on this idea that that God jumped everything off
Yeah.
from the start, right?
Yeah.
So how do you know that? How do you know that thing is true?
True. And that's a lot of what faith is and what the Bible tells us. Faith being this thing that like you can't physically see or know, but you have to believe.
Can't see or know, but have to believe.
Right. Because you have faith that certain things are going to happen, right? Like when you wake up, you have faith that when you go to sleep, you're going to wake up in the morning. Like you don't know that, but you have faith that when you wake up, when you go to sleep, your hope is that you're going to wake up in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example that was given.
You don't think you have any good reasons to believe that you'll wake up in the morning?
No, I mean, like, why? Like, anything could happen to you while you're sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
You're in your most vulnerable state. And so whether you locked your doors, whether, the weather's supposed to be beautiful the next day,
Mm-hmm.
you never know what your body's going to do. And you have to have faith that when you're in your most vulnerable state, that the next morning you're going to wake up.
If you had to rate on a scale of 0 to 100 how certain you are that you're going to wake up tomorrow morning, what would you say it is?
I don't know. I'd say I'm fairly healthy. There's not currently any crazy natural disasters going on. And so I'd have a pretty good feeling that I would be waking up the next morning.
So it sounds like you actually do have some basis upon which to say, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning. I may not be 100% certain, but hey, I'm healthy. There's no natural disasters.
Mm-hmm.
I live in a relatively stable society.
Right.
That doesn't sound
my
like...
neighborhood isn't as dangerous, maybe.
Okay.
Not as many break-ins.
So that doesn't, at that point, that doesn't sound like faith to me. It sounds like you have actually some pretty good evidence that you're going to wake up tomorrow morning.
Yeah, but it's still not certain.
Okay.
And each day isn't certain.
Okay. So you're not certain, but you're somewhat convinced.
Yeah,
You have a degree
have
of certainty.
faith, right? And that's where I use that word faith again, because I do have that faith that the next morning I would wake up.
Huh. You define faith as something that you can't see or know, but have to believe. But it sounds like when it comes to waking up tomorrow morning, you can see and know certain things that lead you to that conclusion.
But not that 100%. And
Okay.
so that's that I believe I could,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know that I could. I have to know. I have to have faith to know that I'm going to wake up. But that's
So are
not
you
100%.
are you saying that you need faith to get you to 100% certainty?
Yeah.
Okay. So what does the other, if we were continuing with this analogy of waking up tomorrow morning, what percentage of certainty does all those factoids give you as far as health, good society, stable environment?
I don't know. It's starting to get to numbers based, but I would say if you're
I mean, I know
in a
this isn't
more
math,
crime-ridden neighborhood, you're more not necessarily the neighborhood itself is crime-ridden, but maybe there's a lot of break-ins, or maybe you're there have been previous evidence of issues in that neighborhood, then or arson in the neighborhood or something like that, like would bring you to maybe feel more unstable when you're going to sleep. If you are in poor health and your body's kind of taken over, then again a lower chance of maybe waking up the next morning.
Why do you feel the need to have 100% certainty? Is 100% certainty necessary?
I wouldn't say it's the need. I would say faith does fill that gap, though.
Okay. Why do you think it's a gap that needs to be filled?
To give us sort of this concept of completion, to give us this, because I can imagine those who don't believe, and I mean, I know there's plenty that don't, but those who don't believe, like, you're leaving life up to chance, and either way, that's so be it, but I wouldn't leave my life up to a dice roll. I would hope that I would have some sort of support, in this case, divine support, that I would be able to fulfill some sort of purpose the next day by waking up.
Okay. So you're saying your need for certainty is really just to provide a certain psychological comfort?
To a certain extent, yeah.
Okay. But it sounds like you can be, if not 100% certain, fairly certain about a lot of things.
Yeah.
Okay. So when it comes to God jumping everything off at the very beginning of time and Him creating everything, what evidence is there to bring you to 100% there? Like, is it pure? Are we talking about purely faith here, or is there any actual evidence?
There has been, and I'm not super up to date necessarily with the science behind the start of life, but there has been evidence to show many of the stories told in the Bible the Bible is seen more of a history book than it is actually of a believer's testimony. There are enough facts and truths that have been scientifically proven to give a lot of truth and knowledge and lower that gap of necessarily faith needing to be there. Faith is still going to get you that 100%. There's still a lot of that scientific evidence to prove that a lot of what's being said in there is true.
When it comes to the claim God started everything, what percentage would you attribute to evidence, and what percentage would you attribute to faith? And so
I would say at the time, in biblical times, it had to be 100% faith, because you saw not a lot of, there's not a lot of evidence that existed at that time. You heard the stories and you heard the stories from your generations, but you also heard the stories from other generations, and other areas had very similar stories. Even today we see that a lot of different religions have a very similar start of existence. And through time they've seen some similarities. And how do you have two people on two different complete continents having similar beginning of time stories, unless it all had to do with itself, and over time they've kind of developed a different concept of reality. But everyone's beginnings are relatively similar. Many of them, not all, but many of their beginnings are very similar. Currently, we have a lot more technology, and we have a lot more ways to prove things, necessarily right or wrong. And I would say that lately, there's been a lot more skeptics. I would say there's a lot more people who don't believe now than ever before. I think every story we hear of previous civilizations, they all have some sort of faith of some sort, whether it be multiple gods or one. And currently we have just a very large portion of society who believes in this science piece that we have that actually does prove a lot more of the existence than it doesn't.
Would you say that the scientific explanation or the God explanation has more evidence going for it?
I think we're using a lot of science to prove that the God thing exists, and people, for some reason, not for some reason, I mean, I get it, for some people who are more, who need that science piece of it more, they're using science for that. There is some people who they've taken what they see in the world, whether it be this carbon dating or something like that, that maybe proves that some things may not be true. And there's evidence to show that carbon dating does fail to a certain point. You can't necessarily plug it into a computer and show millions of years. But then also, at the end of the day, there's always been the question of, did some of these things get put on Earth to test people's faith? And there are these people who, there is evidence against God. And so did some of those things come into play so people can question faith and show the true believers that they have faith over some of the science? There's that argument as well.
Okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the evidence that you have for to establish the truthfulness of the claim, God started everything. So far, I'm seeing one piece of evidence, and that is the similarity of creation stories. Is there anything else you would add to that list of why we know that?
You have the Bible itself, the stories told in the Bible, the similarities of creation stories. And I guess if you're talking at the very beginning, right, without certain pieces of like the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve's fossils like living somewhere that you could actually date back to those individuals, right, you don't have a creation story. But I wouldn't say that there's creation stories either way. I think the only person who truly says that they have evidence of a creation story is the concept of a star exploding in one universe can create a ripple effect through other galaxies. And I wouldn't say that's not necessarily a creation story. Without finding life on other Earth, true life on other Earth, you can't prove that there's anything else besides this life and what started this life. Is it a magical statistical anomaly, or is it actually something or a divine being that's actually controlling what's going on?
Okay. What would decrease your level of certainty in the claim God started everything?
And while I'm talking about like when we get into aliens, like that's where that concept comes from. And so if there was some sort of life on other Earth, that again I would be interesting to see if a life on another Earth would actually say that there is no God, because God didn't say that he only created this life necessarily, that he only created this Earth and this life. Could have totally created life on other Earth, but we don't know that. There's no evidence of that. Theoretically, there's plenty of skeptics, but
are you saying that if there was, though, that might decrease your level of certainty?
It would give me a lot more questions. I wouldn't necessarily decrease my certainty, but I'd be like, why is something else created? But at the same time, we're not supposed to question why other things are done, or why certain, you're not supposed to question why someone passed away. You just assume, or that's where the faith piece is. You just have faith that was supposed to happen for that reason.
When you say faith, I know earlier you described it as something that you can't see or know but have to believe.
Right.
What degree of your confidence in the claim God started everything would you attribute to faith? Is it 50% evidence, 50% faith? How would you divvy up how much of your certainty is evidence and how much of it is not believing in something even though you can't see or know it?
I would say personally, I have more, knowing that I went to a religious high school, so knowing a lot more of that background in my religious high school and knowing more of the Bible, I would credit more of that to biblical background. So I would say it's more of that biblical background, but still it's all coming together with faith. That's why that percentage thing is a hard concept, because you still have to believe that the things put in the Bible were correct. And you still have to believe that if there's multiple creation stories, you still have to believe that the reason that those are similar are not because of colonization, but because those stories are, because those are truly what those people believe in.
Between the evidence from the Bible and the evidence from the similarity of creation stories, which one of those is for you, a bigger piece of the puzzle that establishes your certainty?
I would say I can more that piece of evidence, because at the end of the day, the Bible is a book, and you have to hope, and it's been translated so many different times, and you still have to hope that all those translations, and God put a lot of faith into those or put a lot of effort into making sure that those are faith-based people who put in those translations to educate generations and generations. But the multiple creation stories, I think, is a great testimony to there being one divine individual who put it all together. I think that's more of your tangible physical evidence that you're referring to that shows that how can people from multiple different colonies or continents that have never met each other before have very similar creation stories.
Okay. What would convince you that the similarity in the creation stories was due to some other reason, some reason other than it being some fact of reality? Maybe culture sharing stories, migrations, like what would convince you that it was actually not due to, God actually creating everything?
Yeah. We keep finding artifacts all the time. No one was there, we don't have anyone who was there. Who could tell us right or wrong necessarily. We're continuing to skepticize for the rest of our lives. But I can't think of something that would exist that would prove that wrong. And maybe that's part of the whole thing in the first place. Because we know what we know, as much as we know now based on from history, based on the technology that we have currently. And so, we know from, I guess, unless there was some sort of, what's that concept, the Rosetta Stone? Something that could translate everything and say, actually, no, this colony believed that this is totally different, and actually this concept of reality is totally different than what we've been able to interpret from history. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of colonies from a lot of continents that are so similar that even if you proved one wrong, it would take a bit to actually have to prove everybody wrong.
What kind of similarities are we talking about?
We're talking about, some one big beginning. We're talking about, a fewer generations to more generations to more generations, and them crediting something as the beginning of everything. And they use a lot of these societies or civilizations over time have used, one major being to be the thing that started it all. They don't refer to an explosion in the sky, or they don't refer to I don't know what other people say, amoebas, like cells, and all of a sudden one human was created. Like, how could one human be created and then repopulated? Or I think there's a gap that people are missing between the first human life and repopulating human life over time. I guess there's that evolution from like monkeys that some people believe in. But if that was the case, why aren't we seeing that more? Like, why aren't more things evolving into humans if the human is the ultimate being?
Okay. Man, fascinating stuff,
yeah,
Jason.
It can get deep. It can get all around. You can think about it. But
Man, well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah.